All right, hi everyone. We're here at the Digital Media Research Center at QUT to present a longer version of the paper that we have in the program for AoIR 2021 on fake news. So with me are Stephen Harrington, Eddie Hurcombe, and Dan Angus. Well, here we go. Let me first begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Turrbal and Jagera people as the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT now stands. And of course, we pay respect to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits. We recognize that these unceded lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning, and acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the QUT community. So we're presenting a longer version of our paper on the distribution of mis- and disinformation content on Facebook. This is part of a larger project that actually tries to move us beyond this term fake news and understand in more detail how problematic information of various forms disseminates across social media at scale. We're trying to identify and distinguish different types of problematic information, for instance, by the themes it addresses, by the audiences it engages with, or the dynamics of its distribution. We're focusing here on problematic information on Facebook, and in particular, our project is interested in the dynamics of content sharing over time, so how that changes around key events, how it changes around particular domains being shared, and of course what the impact of takedowns is. In this paper, though, we're focusing particularly also on the networks of interaction and the communities of interest and interaction that emerge from a large-scale longitudinal analysis of this kind of content sharing. Again, this might be thematic communities, ideological communities, or also geographic and language communities that emerge. This is part of a larger ARC Discovery project, a 3-year research project funded by the Australian Research Council on evaluating the challenge of fake news and other malinformation. So the way that we've approached this here is to, in the first place, compile a fairly long list of suspected fake news, mis- and disinformation domains based on a whole bunch of studies that have been conducted previously, and that in their data, in their supplementary materials and elsewhere, have compiled lists of domains that show up as suspected fake news, disinformation sources. And you see some of those references there. That in total has put together a list of more than 2,300 domains. We've then utilized this list of domains to gather data from CrowdTangle, the Facebook data access tool, which provides data on any posts on Facebook, on public pages, public groups, or public verified profiles that contain links to any of these domains. We've done this for the period of the start of January 2016 to the end of March 2021. And in total, this resulted in more than 40 million posts containing links to these suspected problematic information domains. Of course, what this means is that we're not covering any non-public spaces on Facebook. And in fact, I'll use the term and will use the term spaces instead of repeating public pages, groups, and verified profiles from here on in. So we are looking only at public spaces on Facebook. We can't say anything about non-public sharing, about groups and pages that aren't public, or of course about profiles that aren't public. But hopefully what we have here is at least the tip of the iceberg of the dissemination of this kind of content. It's also important to note that CrowdTangle data is substantial, but not entirely complete. Its coverage, particularly for spaces with smaller followings, is incomplete or inconsistent. However, of course, these spaces, because they have smaller followings, are perhaps also somewhat less consequential than the spaces that have very large followings. And finally, the other limitation that's worth mentioning at the start here is that the list of domains that we are dealing with, the fake news list that we've compiled, builds largely on studies that are fairly US or at least Anglo-centric. And of course, there is a lot more problematic content sharing also in languages other than English that is not as well covered by the current research. So we have much more to say at this point about the sharing of problematic information in English than we have in other languages, although these other languages certainly also appear in our data. Just very briefly, in terms of the longitudinal activity, what we're seeing here is the sharing over time, and there are some very obvious peaks and troughs, of course. The US election in 2016 and the inauguration and the ongoing debate after the inauguration about the crowd size, particularly, were first peaks in this period. Of course, as we then lead up to the next US election, there are other peaks as well. In fact, before we get to the election, there's of course the first impeachment of Donald Trump in late 2019, early 2020, and of course then the COVID-19 pandemic that kicks off in early 2020 in full, is declared a pandemic and causes all sorts of disruptions. And that again is also quite a significant peak in activity. Further on, then we also see peaks around the 2020 US election, the riots and insurrection at the Capitol, and of course then the inauguration of Joe Biden as the new US president as well. So this is the activity over time. There are many more peaks and troughs, of course, to be analyzed during this time, but that gives you a general idea of the activity as we see it here. What we have then done with the data, and what we're presenting here is particularly network analysis of the data. My colleagues will take you through the details here, but broadly speaking, we are looking at two types of networks. In the first place, a network between spaces and the domains that they've shared, so a link sharing network. The structure of that network is expected to show particularly how pages, groups, profiles, so spaces on Facebook, cluster around the domains that they commonly share. And that may again be geographic or ideological or various other things. And we've then also done a computational content analysis of the pools that exist in each of these clusters. And then a second network that we're looking at is a network of Facebook on-sharing. So where the spaces that we've observed sharing fake news URLs are actually sharing them in the form of pools that they've shared from other spaces. So that is a subset of the overall data that we've got. It ends up being a network between spaces, a monopartite network between spaces of the same type. So from one public space to another, that's sharing a post from that space. And again, what we're expecting to see here, particularly common interests, common beliefs, common politics in that network. So from here, I'll hand it on to Eddie for an analysis of the link sharing network.
Cool, thanks Axel. So this is just an overall view of our space domain network. Already you can see it's quite polarized into 4 different poles, which we'll just now go through for a closer look. So this is how we've categorized these clusters so far. As you can see that the US progressives are quite at the top, and this is the US conservatives on the left-hand side as well. And then there's some language communities as well, clusters down below, as well as the conspiracies on their own space on the right. Cool. So this is this is a graph based around the location of the page admins, the space admins. So as you can see, most space admins are based in the US, and that reflects our Anglo-centric fake news list. So that's not surprising. But there's also, as I said before, some distinct language communities down the bottom as well. So this is a bit more detailed overview of a network containing the actual domains being shared by these clusters. So maybe we'll just go forward for a closer look. It's okay. So inside this, the US conservatives cluster, we can see that there's subclusters within it. So for example, spaces sharing content around guns, and there's a Tea Party cluster as well. There's also distinct clusters around Christians, but also around, evangelical Christians as well in the End Times cluster. This is a closer look at the language cluster as well. So there's a dominance of France and Germany and Spain mostly, although Italy's down below as well. And we already can see familiar sites like Sputnik News and RT being shared quite a lot in these clusters. This is a closer look at the conspiracy cluster, and this is a bit more sort of diverse, I guess. We can see the alternative food and sort of wellness clusters over there. They're associated with alternative medicine as well, so anti-vaxxer, those types of communities, and we can see autism and anti-vaccination clusters down below there. But also climate change denial too is off somewhere on the side too. There's also a small cluster of UK left, quite small, sharing their own thing as well. But this is a more closer look at the US progressives cluster. So we can see already some quite pro-ecological sites being shared, as well as other kind of familiar, I guess, somewhat maybe more mainstream US progressive sites like the Daily Beast being shared there as well. So this is just an overview of the network again, looking at the difference between pages and groups. As we can see, there's a lot of Facebook pages especially being shared, or sort of dominating, inside the US language clusters, whereas down below in the more European or other language clusters, Facebook groups are being shared as well. So we're still yet to work out why that is, but that's an interesting thing to research going ahead. And this is the overview of the subscriber count. So the darker the red, the more subscribers or, for example, followers the pages or groups have.
All right, I might pick up there. So with the Onsharing network, we went a little bit deeper in terms of the content that is being shared within these groups. And so once again, we see the network structure as a whole, and remember that this is a much smaller subset of the overall post volume we're talking about here, but similarly clustered out like the previous network into a series of subclusters. So what we see here in the first overview are around the specific domains that are being shared, and we do see certain similar patterns in terms of kind of issue clusters occurring there. So if we kind of give this a broad view, like we did previously, we see again this kind of progressive cluster in the top right, near some, what we call the Bernie crats, Bernie Sanders kind of fans or fan base. We also see the kind of those language clusters. So you see a French and a German cluster. Within that, the alternative medicine, climate change denial, so more of what Eddie was talking about there with the conspiratorial thinking. And then below that, you see the Indian, Brazilian, Italian, Spanish, and other communities. But then you've got, once again, this big kind of conservative cluster there. So what we ran over this was a modularity algorithm to try to cache out these clusters so we could identify particular nodes and where they belong within this. And so what we see here are the colorizations of those clusters. And then within that, what we did was siphoned up all of the text that's associated within those to try and characterize what are the main topics of interest within these. It's no surprise that within the conservative cluster then that we see discussion of Trump, of conservatism in general as some of the largest topics of interest there. Moving through as we go up to the top, the Bernie Sanders group, once again, Bernie Sanders, progressive, and others. As we move across into that alt health groupings, we start to see this like chemtrails, wellness. And that's really interesting for us because we're starting to see what I think we're most interested in the project, where you're getting multiple kinds of different conspiratorial groups merging together, perhaps in the way that they're thinking. So, anti-climate change perhaps coming together with that chemtrail, with that health and wellness angle. And that's a specific interest for further research. Into the language groups, I want to say just one caveat that we added a stop list into this that was purely an English stop list. So that's removing words like the, and, of, or, and those kind of general grammatical terms. We didn't process all of the different language that we have in our data set, and that's something to update in further research. So we do see a few of those stop words coming through, but in these other language clusters, we do definitely still see some, kind of classic far right activity and other support. So, within this this one in the middle, it's interesting. This is a very internationally kind of world news flavored group. We see a lot of different kinds of world politics, kind of entering the fray. Palestine, Duterte, and other kind of Jeremy Corbyn and others. So a bit of a mix of both the kind of that far left, but perhaps also a bit of far right content there, also kind of blending in this big melange. And then moving through, you see, once more those kinds of different language groups. This is the French cluster, and in Germany you see, particularly far right groups, AfD and others mentioned within this. As we move through, more of the same here in Italy with the Lega and the Movimento Stella and others, if I'm pronouncing those correctly. And then this is one of the really weird ones actually we got, was one around animals. And this is of interest perhaps to look into a bit more deeply, the idea of those groups that are maybe perhaps being co-opted into these kinds of more conspiratorial thinking. So if you have something perhaps here which is fairly innocuous, say, pet groups or others, are there administrators that may be pushing, or other members pushing, particular kinds of lines of thinking within these groups, trying to move them and their thinking across. And Bolsonaro, of course, there with Brazil, and pro-Modi content, a lot of that for the Indian cluster as well. The Indian cluster is interesting because we do get different language groups within India as well, and so there's a bit of breaking down within that. So once again, looking at the language, the geographic specificity of these groups, we do see a bit of that there, largely thanks to the language that is being used as a way of and clustering those out. But once again, the US content dominating here in the space-based network. And then again, like this breakdown between pages and groups, similarly a preponderance of US-centric pages versus other world content, which is more focused around groups. And then, with the number of subscribers in there as well, we do see kind of centers of mass within these clusters of the larger Facebook spaces that are perhaps attracting, more users and acting as those kinds of hubs in the middle of these minor clusters. So this is more detail on some of those, specific clusters we've talked about already, where we see some of the main kind of topics. Within the US conservatives, we see here, of course, some of those key topics around things like the Daily Wire and Newsbusters, Judicial Watch. So very well known to us at least in mis and disinformation researchers, proponents of that particular US conservative viewpoints. Daily Wire in there again, Breitbart in the middle there, and others. That and no surprise to us appearing in these kinds of data sets. But I will note that these aren't the domains; these are the Facebook entities that are sharing out to those particular domains,
or being shared. So
or being shared by others.
Also the spaces that are being shared the most by other spaces.
Exactly. In the progressives, a lot of this is satire, but it's still picked up because of its highly partisan nature, perhaps, or others. So here we see a really interesting split between the kind of pro-Hillary Clinton progressives and the more pro-Bernie progressives, or anti-Hillary progressives. And so, the kind of the real, as they might call themselves, the real progressives on one side versus others. Around a lot of the European content, we do see the rise of RT and Sputnik within there. So a lot of RT news and Sputnik content making its way through here, particularly in the German cluster and others there.
And inserting itself too, it's worth saying, into some of those other debates as well, other topics like alternative medicine and so on as well. So they're really making themselves visible, or they're being. It's not necessarily them, of course, doing it, but they're really being shared alongside this other sort of alternative health, alternative medicine information, other sorts of topics like that as well.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like we see here as well with the conspiracy theories. I mean, you see this, the Herb's Health and Happiness and the wellness and the Gaia movement and all of these. And the way that many of them, I think, are, getting kind of co-opted. I mean, RT News is right down there at the bottom, which is really interesting how it's kind of been thrust in amongst all of this other stuff. The Geoengineering Watch as well. It's, a lot of this, fairly, I would say, established conspiracies, right? Like these are long running, but how they're being co-opted or such by other players. And yeah, some more detail there again on the conspiracy theories. And yeah, drilling into the France one. Not a lot I can say about that one.
But worth saying, sorry, even here that again we're seeing RT and Sputnik in the French language versions also being quite central to the French disinformation space. So these state actors, these state-controlled entities are really inserting themselves into language-specific debates as well.
Yeah, it's worth saying. I mean, we've got one researcher here in DMRC who is looking very closely at RT, and I think there's going to be some really interesting research coming out on that. Just that, them RT as a very specific entity, a very active one in what they're doing. So definitely some really interesting further study to come from that. More on the Indian content. So this shows that kind of language separation, perhaps, and also around. So you see a Modi cluster at the top. There's also this Modi cluster at the bottom left, but perhaps separated because these are operating, in different languages. Within the Italian cluster again. So yeah, some of that, picking up some more of that far right content we were talking about previously, and like kind of nationalistic chest beating. And once again, that massive node in the middle is another RT. And Sputnik, you can see just kind of edging off the top as well.
All right, so just summing up then some of these findings. Again, there's a lot more work obviously for us to do as well with this data set, but I want to reiterate just first off the limitations. We're dealing with public Facebook spaces only. We don't have data on non-public groups, no data on public or non-public profile activity. And of course, right now, the analysis is only at the domain level. So really what we're seeing here is only the tip of the iceberg. There's every reason to suggest that a lot of the content that we're seeing here, both the URLs being shared, but also the posts being unshared, will also continue to circulate even further into non-public profile-related activity, those privately public spaces on Facebook. We would expect there to be a lot more of that circulation going on even beyond our already quite large data set. What we want to do from here on in, starting out with this data set, is to, in the first place, identify some of the most active pages, groups, profiles that are sharing this fake news content, this problematic content. But we're now also going to extend our data set by taking these active pages and groups and actually gathering data on what else they've been posting. When they're not sharing links to these fake news sites, what else are they talking about? Are they sharing links to other sources that are not on our list yet? So that's a way for us to extend our list of problematic domains even further. Are they sharing non-link posts? So are they sharing memes? Are they sharing images? Are they sharing just text posts or whatever else as well? So what else is that they're doing when they're not sharing these URLs? That also gives us an idea of whether they're full-time conspiracy theorists or full-time engaged in sharing this kind of content, or whether this is just part of what they're doing and they're sharing a lot of other stuff as well, or talking about entirely unrelated topics as well as they're going about their daily business. That, of course, also enables us to do further thematic analysis. We can better understand the kind of content that they're sharing and the kind of topics that they're addressing. But also within the data that we've already got, there's much more thematic analysis to be done, looking at the different network clusters that we've seen across these two different types of networks, seeing how that changes over time as well, of course, how particular world events, for instance, of course, the COVID pandemic, but also elections and other political and other events are changing the kinds of topics being discussed and the volume of discussion, of course, taking place here as well. And ultimately, of course, we don't want to limit this only to Facebook. We have a similar data set for Twitter as well. So we will want to compare activity, patterns, networks on Twitter and Facebook and other platforms as we go forward from here as well. But that gives you an idea of where we're at with this project, and I think already provides some useful insights into the sorts of themes that are represented in this data set, the kinds of topics being discussed, the kinds of groups that are active, and the way that they're linking together and networking together as well. For future work, watch this space. We'll certainly have much more to say with this data set. I want to finish here by first, again, thanking our funders and, of course, acknowledging CrowdTangle as well as the source of this data. And just finally, these are the sources particularly that we've been drawing on in order to compile our list of problematic news sources. So thank you to all of them as well for providing the work that they've done and providing the list of pages that they have identified in their data sets as well. So thank you, and we hope this was useful. We look forward to your comments.